This week's First Chapter Fridays is The Lost Wonderland Diaries by author J. Scott Savage. Sit back, relax, and use your imagination as we read the first chapter of this book. Chapter 1, The Right Time. Is it time? Is it time? Is it time? The question bounced around the rabbit family warren like a well-hit crochet ball. Uncle Lop Rabbit tugged his great coat tightly around his shoulders, despite the weather being unseasonably warm, and held a single glass lens up to his eye to examine those around him with great scrutiny, mixed with a dash of befuddlement. I've heard the Arthema Sea is as purple as an eggplant, and the schools of numbers are in a tizzy. It must be time. Aunt Agora Rabbit squirmed in her corset and flicked one long ear. I've heard it's twice as purple as a plum. Creatures of enormous size and questionable integrity are rising from the depths. High time, I'd say. Past time, if you ask me, Cousin Lilac huffed. The Queen has declared a quarantine over all of Wonderland. She's locked the castle gates, and the guards are seizing anyone trying to get in or out. The guards, whispered the rest of the family, twitching their noses and thumping their feet. Have you heard about what happened to... You know who? Asked Nephew Rex. He was attacked by a beast, whispered one voice. A monster, murmured another. A demon, a fiend, a monstrosity, Grandmother Sable said with a shiver. It got everyone at his house. And now they've got madder than the mad, Niece Satin said around a mouthful of carrot. It's getting worse every day. The twins, Pelfrey and Pannin, spoke in unison like always. Although they were well known as the gossips of the family, it was universally recognized that what they said almost always came true. The Grafins turned savage in the middle of the last lobster quadrille and ate the entire class. Something's been horrificating the avians. Rabid beasts have been reported in the Duchess's woods. The two of them pressed their heads together, long ears quivering as though sharing information, then nodded in unison. Everyone is saying the end of Wonderland is near. The end of Wonderland, Mother Martian squeaked. Father Fave's applewood pipe fell out of his mouth, spreading hot ashes across his feet, but he barely noticed. The end of Wonderland? The end of Wonderland? The end of Wonderland? The end of Wonderland! It quickly turned into a chant, and the sound of thumping feet echoed for miles. The whole rabbit family might have fled in a panic if great-great-great-grandfather Gotland Rabbit hadn't chosen that moment to shuffle out of his den in a checkered bathrobe and a worn pair of bunny slippers, which bore a striking resemblance to fuzzy Aunt Rhinelander. Can't a rabbit take a nap in peace around here? He complained, rubbing the top of his bald head. It's bad enough that my bladder is bashful and my liver is laughable. Now I must put up with the ruckus of rambunctious relatives riding above my room. What's all this ruminating?" "It's the end of Wonderland," shrilled Pika. No one was entirely sure how he was related, or if he was actually a member of the rabbit family at all, but everyone nodded. "A run on underwear, you say?" Grandfather Gotlin asked with a scowl. "The end of Wonderland," Satin shouted, spraying bits of chewed carrots everywhere. Grandfather Gotlin flicked an orange sliver disdainfully from his robe. "Why would anyone want to listen to a thunder band?" "For lettuce's sake," the great-great-great-grandmother Gabbily Rabbit said. She lifted one of Gotlin's floppy ears and yelled, "The family thinks it might be the end of Wonderland. They want to know if it is time." Grandfather rubbed his ear. "You don't have to shout." He twisted his left and right, his spine cracking in at least a dozen places, then tugged up the waistband of his pajamas. "Bring out the clocks." "The clocks?" the family murmured as a pair of well-muscled rabbits in matching uniforms turned to two large wooden doors that hadn't been opened for as long as any of them could remember. It took the clock keepers several minutes to figure out which of them had the key. And when they did, the lock was so rusty it refused to turn at first. But eventually it clicked, and the huge doors swung open with a squeak of rusty metal hinges. A moment later, the rabbits rolled out a strange-looking contraption made of hundreds of differently shaped gears, dozens of springs, several pipes, numerous levers, and two large clock hands. "The clock of Dithering," Uncle Lop whispered, studying it through his eyes. Grandfather Gotlin waggled his whiskers as the great mechanical clock was rolled up before him. "I seem to recall..." He reached for a lever with a red knob, but hesitated. Or was it? He began to twist a silver crank, then shook his head. That's not right." After several minutes of starting and stopping, he finally grabbed the biggest handle he could find, closed his eyes, and tugged. Springs sprung, gears whirled, pipes spewed clouds of smoke, and whistled ear-piercing screeches. The two clock hands whirled until they were nothing but a blur before stopping abruptly with a loud double clonk clonk. Great-great-great-grandfather Gotlin studied the clock, tilting his head first one way, then the other. "Well?" Cousin Lilac asked, wringing her paws. "Is it time?" "I would say," he shuffled his slippers, "that is, if I were to hazard a guess." Finally, great-great-great-grandmother Gabbily elbowed past him and studied the placement of the clock hands. "Good news," she announced. "It's not quite time to panic." There was a general sigh of relief from the family, followed by a feeling of unrest. "You told us what time it isn't," Mother Martian said. "But what time is it?" Grandfather puffed out his chest, resuming his spot at the front of the crowd. Don't be ridiculous. The clock of dithering only tells what time it is not. An excellent choice when you are early enough to dawdle or late enough that there's no point in bothering. To learn what time it is, we will need the clock of action. Once again, the soldiers marched through the doors. A moment later, they rolled out an enormous wheel of cheese, Father Fave asked. The best carrots can buy, Grandfather said. Created by a team of skilled artisan mice, Grandmother added as the clock keepers wheeled the cheese clock into place. Sunlight shone through hundreds of holes in the large wheel, creating dozens of overlapping circles of light on the ground. The numbers on the clock face began at 1 3/4 and ended at 13 10/6. A silver butter knife pointed at 7 1/2, while a tarnished cake fork sat halfway between 3 1/3 and 4 7/10. The finest Swiss craftsmanship, Aunt Angora said approvingly. When at last the wheel was in place, Grandfather waved his hands. A little to the left. The rabbits rotated the cheese wheel. The circles of sunlight in front of the clock began shifting towards one another. A little more, Grandfather said. Slowly, the rabbits moved the wheel until all the holes lined up just right to form a single, perfect circle of light on the ground. A loud chime came from somewhere deep inside the cheese. Click by click, the fork and knife moved until they were both aligned at the top. Grandfather Gotland's eyes widened. His ears flapped. His whiskers wilted. It is time. He reached into one of the holes in the cheese wheel and pulled out a sheet of parchment so old it looked like the barest breeze would tear it to shreds. It was covered with folds, wrinkles, and small tears. Several spots had been clearly glued back together. Many years ago, Grandfather Gotland said in a trembling voice, the outsider predicted that after he left us, Wonderland would one day face grave peril. On that day, he said, we should call another from his world, one who would come to Wonderland and save us all. A hushed silence fell over the family as Grandfather unrolled the parchment. The one who will save us is... Narrowing his eyes, he turned the paper one way and then another. Finally, he pulled a pair of gold spectacles from his robe pocket and nodded. The one who will save us is the Alice. The Alice, the family murmured. We must go far and wide, telling everyone in Wonderland to stay strong, Grandmother said. The Alice is on the way. But who will summon the Alice? One of the rabbits shouted. It should be the one who met the last outsider, grandfather said. The Queen's original timekeeper, the one who gave the rabbit family our great purpose in the first place. Pika's round ears quivered. You mean what? Shh, the rest of the family hissed. Grandfather shivered and rubbed at a cabbage stain on the sleeve of his bathrobe. Is anyone willing to speak to? All the rabbit family members looked at one another, shaking their heads. He's in no shape to call anyone, the twins said in unison. Someone else must take his place, grandmother said. Do we have a volunteer? I have a pressing engagement to, Uncle Lop said, edging backwards. Aunt Angora shook her head. I'd be happy to if I didn't. Under other circumstances, you see, Cousin Velveteen began. One by one, each mother, father, brother, sister, cousin, grandmother, grandfather, child, in-law, and fiancé slipped away, each making half-hearted excuses, until only one rabbit was left. Sidelin, one of the youngest members of the rabbit family, barely out of bunnyhood, had been sketching pictures in the dirt with a stick, not paying attention to what was going on around her. It wasn't until the last of the relatives had disappeared that she looked up to discover her great-great-great-grandparents staring at her. Did someone say something? She asked, having no idea what she was about to get herself into. Great-great-great-grandmother and great-great-great-grandfather looked at each other and nodded. She'll do perfectly. That was the first chapter from the Lost Wonderland Diaries by J. Scott Savage. Stop by the library to find out what happens and if the rabbits can save Wonderland. Thank you for joining us this week. I hope you come back for another first chapter of one of our books.